Hi everyone, and welcome back to Lemon Dew. I'm Brie, and in today's episode, I'm going to be talking about my experiences of being an autistic student in secondary school during year 11. So, before I begin, of course, I will have a disclaimer. I will not be using real names when referring to people, mainly to protect identities and such, including my own. And also, in this particular episode, I'm not really going to be delving into sensitive topics, primarily because there aren't as many like the previous episodes. So, without further ado, let's begin. So, going into year 11, I actually had what was considered to be the most tolerable year during my time at secondary school. Whilst I did have a couple of issues, they weren't as prevalent as, say, year 9 or year 10. Now, when it came to year 11, I think this was kind of the point where some of my self esteem started to grow in terms of making new friends and also repairing friendships that pretty much went to shit, to put it lightly. So, I guess I can say that I was able to somewhat cope okay, mainly because I was in the process of leaving secondary school and going to college, where I had an opportunity to gain a fresh start. When it came to year 11, my main focus was finishing my GCSEs so that I could leave. Because one of the most relieving things, I guess, was the fact that after year 11, I didn't have to see my teachers again and I didn't have to see the same girls that were bullying me again. So, in year 11, I would say for the most part, when it came to certain subjects, primarily GCSE, German, and science, I didn't really care very much for them. I had a habit of coming in late to those particular classes and would sometimes be reprimanded by my teachers. But then again, I got to a point where I just didn't really care as much, primarily because I didn't really have any interest in those subjects and knew that I was going to fail anyway. As per mentioned in some earlier episodes, when it came to my GCSEs, the way my mind worked was that if there was a subject that I was interested in at school, I would actually put in my 100%. But if there was an instance where I didn't like a particular subject, then I was not going to try. And at one point during parents' evening, I actually did admit that I was going to fail GCSE German to my German teacher and that I didn't care for the subject. Another subject that I didn't really like was GCSE history. So, as per mentioned before in an earlier episode, the only reason that I picked history as one of my options was because I didn't really like geography and I didn't like my teacher much. And there was no way that I was going to subject myself to 2 years of GCSE ICT because in year 9 I pretty much had issues with my ICT teacher who disrespected me and insulted my intelligence in front of the class, whilst also disrespecting me again in front of my mum at parents' evening. So, when it came to GCSE history, I remember in parents' evening, I met my history teacher with my mum, and my history teacher informed me that I was at risk of failing the subject. I actually used to get U grades in my mock exams for GCSE history, and what didn't really help was the fact that I never really understood the course material. So, the thing with me in school was that I was a visual learner, and even today, as an adult at 25, I'm still a visual learner when it comes to, say, my work. So if there is something that I don't understand, I would prefer visual demonstrations or practicals because it's easier for me to get to grips with new subjects, or if I'm at work, since I do work a full time job now, new working methods. And that way I can pick up exactly what I need to do if I'm learning something I've never really done before. With GCSE history, just like the majority of my subjects, there was a kind of one size fits all approach to learning. So I remember in GCSE history, I would often be referring to textbooks when doing revision, and my teacher would be talking at the same time whilst we had to jot down notes. And I wasn't really taking in anything because nothing made sense to me. And it didn't really help that I had no interest in the subject whatsoever, especially because when I used to do that particular subject, I would mostly sort of zone out and get to a point where I felt that my body was in the classroom, but then my mind and my soul was just somewhere else, completely distracted from everything that was going on around me. And I also used to draw a lot in GCSE history. Sometimes my teacher would often tell me to stop drawing in my lessons, but it was something I loved to do because I was always a creative person from when I was a child. And that is something that has not been let go, if that makes sense, to this day. So, with GCSE history, I remember saying to my history teacher that I wanted to drop the subject because even though my target grade in my real GCSE exam was an E grade, I knew that realistically I wasn't going to get an E grade, let alone pass the subject. So I felt that it was better for me to drop it anyway. I actually remember at one point having a key worker who tried to help me revise for GCSE history, but I told them that there was no point in attempting to help me because nothing was going in, and I got to a point where I pretty much just gave up. So, after speaking to Kids Company, which was basically where I used to do therapy in school, I eventually managed to get them to pass on some information to my year leader, who talked to me about dropping GCSE history. And funnily enough, I actually talked to one of my former friends, Brooke, at the time, who actually helped me sort of speak to the teachers, because I remember before she left herself, which was in year 10, she used to do GCSE history, but we weren't really in the same class or anything. So, she was in a different set, and I think I was in the higher set because I remember I always used to be placed in the higher sets for the majority of my subjects. And at the time, she told me she dropped GCSE history herself because, like myself, she was having problems understanding the course material. So, with a bit of her help, I did manage to talk to my year leader at the time and I dropped the subject. So, every time I had that hour, which was used for GCSE history, I would mostly use that hour to work in the prayer room, and I would mostly spend my time doing my GCSE coursework. So I was mostly doing my catering coursework because I actually did have quite a lot of assignments to finish off in that particular subject. And if the teacher wasn't there, I would call one of my closest friends at the time, Mariam, via FaceTime. So we would mostly do a lot of video chatting. And it was actually fun, especially because there was no teacher present. So the only instance a teacher would come in just to check on how I was doing, maybe every 15 minutes or so. But otherwise, no one really caught me for using my phone or anything. And it wasn't like I cared that much. Now, when it came to my GCSEs, I always did better in coursework than exams. So, looking back at the way I sort of finished as well as my grades, I always had higher grades in my coursework. And I think it's because I always knew but didn't realize until college that I was more of a person who preferred practicals rather than exams. Because when I used to do exams in my GCSEs, multiple choice questions in particular would really throw me off. And if there was a certain subject where I knew I wasn't good at a particular topic or something, then it would be very difficult for me to get through the exams. From what I do remember in year 11, the teachers, at least from personal experience, didn't really help us revise properly, so most of the revision came from textbooks or past papers. And I used to do past papers a lot at home and sort of use my own methods to help myself revise because the teachers just wouldn't really sort of adapt proper methods to help us understand the material. And then when it came to my real exams, I pretty much just tried the best that I could, really. Now, whilst I was doing my GCSEs as well, I was in the process of preparing to go to a sixth form slash college. So obviously, I had to apply for different colleges, and there were quite a few open days I attended. And I actually remember as well, I think whilst I was in the middle of applying for different colleges, I saw a careers advisor at my school once, and we were basically going over what kind of options I wanted to consider for college. So the options that I knew I wanted to consider were mainly creative options like A levels in art and design, of course, as well as photography. And I remember I wanted to do something relating to creative writing. And I can't remember what other subject I wanted to study in college, but those were the three main ones because I always had a passion for the creatives. Now, my careers advisor pretty much told me that a lot of students who picked creative options would also pick academic options. So, just like the majority of my teachers, they were trying to steer me towards academic options, primarily something along the lines of English, maths, and science. So, it was like they were basically discouraging me from choosing something that I actually had a passion in. And that was one of my main issues when I was a student in secondary school, was that every time teachers used to ask me what I wanted to do in the future and I mentioned being an artist, they would always try to get me to change my mind and say something along the lines of, why don't I become an engineer instead, or a mathematician? And it was almost as if, if you studied a creative subject, teachers would try and get you to sort of come out of your creative side, if that makes sense. So, my school was the type that was more focused on academics. So, from what I remember, there wasn't really as much funding for creative subjects, and that tends to be very common in a lot of institutes where not much funding is put into the creatives. And it was kind of the same thing in my college as well, where funding was often put into specific departments more than others. So, being around that careers advisor in particular didn't really help me because, as per mentioned, they really tried to sort of tear me down. At least that was how I felt at the time. And I was just kind of being told that I have to choose a completely different path for college, one that I knew I had no interest in. And from personal experience, if I am not interested in a particular subject, then I feel that it would have been a waste of time putting in effort into something that I didn't really care about. Because when you leave college as well, obviously you have to decide what you want to do in university or whether you want to skip university and take a gap year. So, another issue I feel is very prevalent, at least in the modern education system, is that students don't really get the chance to explore alternate options. You just kind of have to stick to this traditional path of academia. And the thing is, as well, is that not every single student is an academic person, hence why the one size fits all approach in schools doesn't work. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that everyone has different interests and that everyone is good at different subjects. And you can't really force students to take an interest in a particular subject if it's something they're not passionate about. And that was what really bothered me about secondary school. So, when it came to my real GCSEs, I do remember often going on study leave and spending time with friends trying to study as often as I could. Like at one point, I remember inviting some of my friends to my house to study because mine was like the nearest to our secondary school. And we had a bit of a study session where we were trying to revise all of the material for our RE exam. But with my GCSEs, for the most part, I actually put in effort when it came to my English and maths exams, only because I didn't want to do resits in college. And then my catering coursework and exam, I felt like I put a lot of effort into that. And the same thing applied to art. As for science, I did try the best I could with my coursework in such little time, considering that I didn't have the best teacher. But then I remember failing in my coursework, so I just gave up when it came to the exam. And then with German, I think I passed in my coursework, but then I did request to do a foundation paper in my exam because I knew that I wasn't going to be good with the higher paper. So that was why I ended up doing a foundation in that particular subject. So when it came to my GCSE results, there were a couple of instances where I was a bit upset with certain results. So I think when it came to GCSE art, I was the most upset with that particular result because I poured my heart into my coursework only to get a C grade. And then I was a bit upset with catering as well because at the time I got an A in my coursework and then I got a B in my exam because I missed out on an A by a couple of marks. Although I still did quite well in my catering exam, considering that I had four different teachers in the course of year 10 and about 2 months to do 2 years worth of coursework in year 11. So I still did well. And I think that was partially because not only was I passionate about the subject, but I had a teacher who genuinely had faith in me to do well because they saw my potential. It was just I was being held back by poor teaching. And then when it came to English language, I got a B grade in that, as well as a C in literature and a C in maths, which was surprising because there were a couple of A level style topics that came up that were very unfamiliar to me. And then as for German and the sciences, I pretty much got D grades in that as well as RE, but I didn't really care that much because I wasn't going to do those subjects in college. So on the same day as my GCSE results day, I remember going to the first college of my choice to bring my results over so that I could finalize the courses that I wanted to study. Although at the time, I do remember being disappointed that I couldn't do A levels because since I didn't really have overly high grades, with the exception of English language and catering, my predicted A level grades would have been along the lines of CCD or something like that. So I ended up choosing to study a BTEC Level 3 extended diploma in art and design. So that was what I was studying in college, the first year being a 90 credit, the second year being the extended diploma, and of course, I am going to be talking more about my college and university experiences, which will be in my next episode. So I just wanted to say thank you for listening to this episode. It is a bit short compared to my other ones, primarily because year 11, I didn't really have many problems because, as I said, it was the most tolerable year in secondary school. And I was glad because the year was a bit smoother, I guess, with the exception of not getting some of the GCSE results that I wanted. So, as always, I want to thank you for supporting my podcast. So, I am going to be having a break next week, and my next episode, which is going to be about college and university and my experiences of being an autistic student during those particular years, will be released on the 6th of April, which will be after the Easter holiday. So, of course, I am going to be getting my material prepped so that I can share my experiences. And the 6th of April, no, sorry, wait, the 7th of April, to correct myself, is when the next episode is going to be released. So the 6th of April is when I'm going to record, and then the 7th of April is when the next episode is going to be released. So, of course, this is after the Easter holiday. So, I hope that you guys have enjoyed listening to today's episode with my usual ramblings. And as per usual, thank you for supporting me and thank you for supporting this podcast. I will strive to not only upload more episodes, but as I go along, improve the quality of my podcast. And I would really appreciate if you could provide some comments and feedback and maybe some suggestions to help me improve the quality of this podcast as well. It would be great. So, of course, I am going to be off, and I hope you all have a great day. And I hope that in the next week, if you do celebrate the Easter holidays, you enjoy your Easter. Thank you. Bye.